questo punto siamo al core della nostra giornata e quindi invito il professor Robert Stavins, che ci ha fatto questo regalo di giungere ieri insieme alla sua consorte per partecipare come keynote speaker alla nostra iniziativa. Caro Robert, if you want to come to the podium, we will hear to you, we listen to you with a lot of attention. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and first of all, thank you, Franco. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to be with you this morning and to follow up on the interesting comments that we heard from Mr. Bafulco and from Mr. Macaferi as well. Both of them introduced the importance of an issue that I am going to talk about, which is global climate change, including the important and challenging policy developments that you are and will experience in Europe. I first of all want to say that it's wonderful to be back in Italy. I'm here with some relative frequency in various parts of the country. I'm embarrassed to say, however, that after my many visits here, the only words that I've been able to master within the language are Brunello and Barolo, and a few other types of vino as well. But it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for fantastic hospitality. This is an important conference on a very important topic, and a topic that will be of increasing importance as time goes on. So a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this will be even more important than it is today. What I'm going to do, as you can see, is to provide an economic view of environmental protection. So I'm stepping back from some of the details of the issues that you will be addressing today in the industry roundtables in order to try to provide a broader framework for thinking about these challenges of sustainability, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And then I'm going to turn to what is going to be an increasingly important issue for every industry within manufacturing, and indeed within services economy as well, and that's the issue of global climate change. So let me begin then by telling you a story, if you don't mind. So I got on an airplane a while ago at Boston Logan Airport, and I sat down in my seat, and the gentleman who sat down next to me, it became clear, wanted to have a conversation. Now, maybe you have noticed what I've noticed, and that is there are two kinds of people who tend to fly: those who like to have conversations with perfect strangers, and then the rest of us. So I'm very much in that second category. I don't like to have conversations on planes, and so I always have some work, a newspaper, or a book, even if I'm not interested in it, just to ward off that unwanted conversation with a stranger. But the gentleman next to me was very determined, and so he's tried to start out the conversation the way Americans often do. He said, "What business are you in? You know, what do you do for a living?" And unfortunately, I did something foolish. I told the truth. And I said, "Well, I'm an environmental economist." And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he didn't say anything further. Now, here's this man who really wants to have a conversation, but he doesn't follow up. And I'm certainly not going to follow up because I don't want to talk to him in the first place. So we looked in each other's eyes for quite a while. And then it dawned on me. I understood suddenly why it was that this man who wanted so much to have a conversation was not following up. And I decided it was because he had realized or concluded that he had just met a living, breathing oxymoron, an internal contradiction. An internal contradiction. After all, it's either the economy or the environment. It's either economics or the study of the environment. So what does this phrase, environmental economics, even mean? It made absolutely no sense. So the first point I want to make to you is that environmental economics is not oxymoronic. It is not an internal contradiction, and I say it for specific reasons. The first one is that the causes of environmental problems in a market economy are economic. Environmental problems are the unintended side effects of market activity, of activity that is highly meritorious, that is very desirable. That's including firms, companies that are producing products, goods and services that consumers want. And it also includes the other side of market activity, which is consumers purchasing and using those products. And in the process of producing products and consuming products, these unintended side effects take place, which, as you'll see, economists label for a very specific reason as an externality. So that's the first reason why it's not oxymoronic, that the causes of environmental problems are economic. The second is that the consequences of environmental problems have important economic dimensions, as I will also show you with some examples. Therefore, if the causes are economic and the consequences have important economic dimensions, then an economic perspective is not only helpful, it's actually essential for a full understanding of environmental problems, and therefore it can be exceptionally helpful for the design of solutions that will be effective, that won't just give lip service or have symbolic effects, but will actually do something about the problems, for policies that are economically sensible, by which I mean they're cost effective, that we're doing whatever we're accomplishing at the lowest possible cost, not wasting resources in the process, which many policies tend to lead us to do, and that therefore, if they are cost effective, are more likely to be politically practical and pragmatic. So I view this economic perspective as absolutely essential for a full understanding of environmental problems. So let me first say a bit more about the causes, and then I'll say a bit about the consequences. So I'm going to think of the context of firms in the United States, and then I'm going to turn to thinking about Europe as I move forward. And I want to pose a question that we heard earlier, and you're going to hear later today in the industry roundtables, that there are situations in which carrying out activities in a more sustainable way, because they essentially save on inputs, save on resources, may reduce disposal costs and the like, can actually be positive in the bottom line of the company. They can actually augment profits. I'm going to ask a broader question. What about those situations in which they don't do that? Those situations in which there is a sacrifice of profits, in particular, not just to comply with an environmental regulation, but to go beyond that environmental regulation. And the question I'm going to ask is whether or not firms may do that. Not can they do it, are they able, but may they do it, are they permitted? And I'm thinking, again, in the context, as you'll see, of the country that I know best, the United States. Well, let's first think about publicly owned firms, firms that are listed on a stock exchange and other publicly traded companies. Well, as you know, under the law, the function, the purpose of a publicly traded company in the United States is not, the purpose is not to make steel, it's not to make cars, it's not to make environmental quality. The purpose of the company is to make one thing in the eyes of the law: make money. That's the purpose. And that company has a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, not to make steel, not to make environmental quality, not to make anything else, to make profits. That's their responsibility. And the Securities and Exchange Commission in my country will go after them if they're violating their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Now, that would suggest that they can't go beyond compliance with the law, even if they might think it's a good thing for the environment. But there are some subtleties. And that is that throughout the US, the states have found that when there are shareholder lawsuits about a company going too far, whether it's on behalf of environmental protection or donating to the local symphony orchestra because the wife of the chairman of the board happened to like the symphony, that when there are shareholder lawsuits, the courts are willing to second guess companies in lots of ways, but there's one way in which the courts feel the companies know best, and that's how to make money. They figure that they know how to profit maximize, and that therefore, under what's come to be known informally as the business judgment rule, if a company is making a business judgment, can make a business case, then the challenges from shareholders will fail. And that's why when you see examples of companies in the environmental realm going beyond the letter of the law, and there are some that do, as you'll see, they will usually justify it rightly, as we heard earlier and we'll hear later today, or sometimes not so rightly. They will justify it as aiding the bottom line of the company. And it may be that it doesn't help profits today. They might say quite reasonably that, well, as a result of being a better environmental citizen, when we want to build that new plant, we're not going to have as many objections from the local population. It'll be easier to site it. And so there's a public relations value to this. But they'll always seek to justify it in that way. Now, we can ask a broader question. What if the company we're thinking of is not publicly traded? What if it's privately held? This whole issue then of fiduciary responsibility of shareholders goes away. And now we can ask the question, not may they, not are they permitted to, but can they? Are they able to go beyond full compliance on a sustainable basis, on an ongoing basis? And here we need to distinguish various possibilities. Now, one possibility is that you'd think, well, yes, they could go beyond compliance and they could simply pass on their increased costs to consumers by increasing their prices. Well, there are some companies that can do that for their products, and there are some companies that can't do that for their products. So at one extreme, we have commodities. My example to you would be rolled steel. One bit of rolled steel looks like another bit of rolled steel. Consumers, when they buy a refrigerator, an automobile, or a computer, don't know anything about the rolled steel that went into it. They just see that final product. That's a commodity market. And in a commodity market, if one attempts to increase one's prices by even a small amount, then one loses market share to others, because by definition, that commodity is indistinguishable from others. At the other extreme of what is a continuous spectrum are niche markets, in which case green products or products that come from environmentally responsible firms can find ready markets because of the fact that in those niche markets, the firms can pass on the price. In fact, a PhD student of mine a few years ago, as part of his dissertation, carried out a statistical analysis to find out which companies in the US were actually going beyond the letter of the law and what were the characteristics of those companies. And at first blush, at first guess, you might say, well, those must have been ones that had CEOs that were particularly strong environmentalists. Well, it turned out he didn't see a lot of difference in the demographics or anything in that way. The factor that most explained whether or not companies went beyond the law was the competitiveness of their markets. because which firms can pass on prices? Firms with market power. Another way of saying that you occupy a beautiful position in a niche market is that you have a local monopoly. And monopolists, of course, can pass on prices. And in fact, that's what we see, is that those firms that enjoy market power are more able to pass on prices because they don't have to worry about their competitors underpricing them because they don't face competitors. Now, having said that, I want to ask what happens to this pollution that comes from a firm, because it goes somewhere. And in order to think about what the effects are of that pollution, let's think about our steel plant that's burning dirty fuel and emits pollutants, including particles, small particulates. And next door is a commercial laundry. And that commercial laundry washes clothes and it dries clothes. But they find that all of the soot from the factory next door is beginning to come inside the dryers. And after they've washed the clothes and they dry the clothes, they're dirty again. Well, what does that tell us? That tells us that there's a problem there. Now, what does the laundry do? Well, one thing the laundry could do is it could build some big filters on top of its roof where it's pulling in the air. And there would be a cost for that. And we should ask, if we look at the annual report of the steel company, does the cost to the laundry next door show up? And of course, unless there was a lawsuit or something else, that cost doesn't show up. That cost is external to the decision-making of the plant. That's the cause of environmental problems. The fact that a company doing meritorious, desirable activity, producing a product we want, namely in this case rolled steel, is emitting pollutants which have a cost associated with them, but the cost shows up somewhere else. It is external to their decision-making. And that's why if you talk to an economist about the environment, within 1 minute, you will hear the phrase, pollution is an externality. And that's the cause of environmental pollution. This also enables us to think about the consequences. So I want to turn to that other side of the ledger, the economic consequences of pollution. Well, we already saw one example. This is steel production in the laundry services. And it's obvious that it's an economic effect. I put a dollar sign there. It's obvious it's an economic effect because we said there's a cost in terms of that filter that could be placed. And I want to label that as an externality that goes from a producer to a producer. In this case, a producer of steel to a producer of laundry services. But that's only one potential type of environmental externality, and it turns out it's not a very important one. Much more important are externalities that go from producers to consumers. And an example I'll give you here is paper production, which, as you know, the way that at least the paper I'm using is white. I'm not using brown paper. Probably none of you are using brown paper. But if you've been at a paper mill, you know that the pulp, when it's produced, is brown, dark brown. And that pulp, as paper is produced, two things happen. One is a tremendous amount of water is squeezed out. That's essentially the difference between paper and pulp, is the water is gone. And the other is that we bleach the product so that it's white and we can write on it. Now, it used to be done with chlorine bleach. Today, there are other more environmentally benign methods. But in any event, even the water itself that comes out is going to be warmed by the process. It's such a water-intensive process that in the United States, we used to actually build the paper mills in Maine above rivers so that they could dump the wastewater directly into the stream, believe it or not. But it warms the water. And anyone here who likes to go fishing, particularly for trout, you know that fish, a lot of species, don't like warm water. So as a result of producing this paper, we can lower the quality of fishing downstream, recreational fishing. I didn't say commercial fishing. And the reason I'm saying this is that there's no dollar sign. It's just reduced the pleasure of someone downstream. But that's an economic impact as much as the first one is, even though it's not an obvious financial impact. Because economics is not accounting. accounting is a subset of economics. And to make that point further, let me go on and to say we could also have externalities that go from consumers to consumers. I mean, the best example of this that is beyond the environment area, perhaps, is secondary exposure to cigarette smoke. That someone is consuming cigarettes, that's their business. If someone else is exposed to the cigarette smoke and they don't smoke themselves, then there can be health damages or at least annoyance, and that's an externality from consumers to consumers. Again, no dollar sign. And then finally, externalities from consumers to producers. And the example I give you here is littering in a movie theater. You know, I mean, I don't know how many of you have been to the United States. If you have, you know that there's something very important about Americans, that we are required to eat at all times, in all places. And in particular in movie theaters. And movie theaters, therefore, when they sell containers of popcorn, which is the preferred thing to eat in an American movie theater, the sizes of popcorn come in containers which are large, huge, and ridiculous. And so oftentimes, therefore, people leave waste on the floor of the movie theater. It's an externality because it drives up the costs of the movie theater. That has a dollar sign. The point I want to make with this is that most environmental problems, including virtually all of the environmental problems that you will talk about today, don't fit into category 1 or 4, the ones with the dollar signs. They all almost all fit into categories 2 and 3, including global climate change, are all in 2 and 3. Externalities from producers to consumers and consumers to other consumers. But those are as much economic consequences as the others, because economics is not accounting. The economic consequences are greater than the financial consequences. And so the most important economic impacts are not the ones that are most obvious. This produces a great challenge for analysis, because it means when the analysis is carried out, whether it's by the government in Rome or the government in Brussels for the EU, there is a temptation with the analysis to look at where the data is most available. And the data on the economics is easiest to see, easiest to understand on categories 1 and 4, but they're a very small part of the story. Now, this kind of economic perspective is particularly important when thinking about global climate change. And so for the rest of my time this morning, that's what I'm going to talk about, in particular about public policy. Because if it's not affecting you now, and in Europe it is to some degree, it's going to affect you even more. I'm not referring to climate change itself, I'm referring to public policies to address climate change. That's what will be most affected here. We just heard this morning about the important announcement that came in Beijing from the heads of state of China and the United States. I'm going to take you from that in the next few minutes to what will be happening soon in Lima, Peru, where I'll be going in a couple of weeks for the annual climate negotiations, all of which culminates in what will be a new international agreement in Paris in December of 2015. But first, to give a little bit of background to this, for those of you who aren't familiar, if anyone is not, with climate change, I want to very quickly offer an explication of how the science leads to the economics and how the economics lead to the basic geopolitics. So the most important fact to recognize about greenhouse gases is that they mix in the atmosphere. It doesn't matter if the emissions come from Milano or they come from Beijing or they come from New York, they have exactly the same effect on the climate. That's a very important fact. It means the location of the emissions has no effect on the impacts. That's essentially what a global commons problem is. The reason this is so important is that it means that any individual jurisdiction that takes action, whether it's a city, a state, a country, or even a region such as the European Union, it pays the direct costs of its actions, but the benefits of its actions are distributed globally. In fact, more than that, the benefits of those actions are going to be concentrated in the tropical regions of the globe where the damages of climate change for various reasons will be greatest. What that means then is since each jurisdiction pays its direct costs, but it only gets a tiny share of the direct benefits, it means that for virtually any jurisdictions, the direct benefits it reaps will be less than the direct costs that it incurs, despite the fact that the global benefits of its action may be greater, indeed much greater, than the global costs of its actions. That's the definition of a classic free rider problem. It means it's in the interest of every jurisdiction to wait and to benefit from the actions of others, which is why, from an economic perspective, when we look at the inaction of some countries, economists aren't surprised. Economists are surprised, if anything, by the action, the pro-action for many years now of the European Union. So what does this tell us? It tells us that leaving it up to individual countries is not sufficient. It is for many environmental problems. For localized air pollution problems, countries can deal with it one at a time. Even for transboundary pollution problems like acid rain, one country can do it or two countries cooperating can do it. But when we talk about global climate change, international cooperation is required, although not necessarily global cooperation, as I will emphasize. It's also why the highest levels of effective governance need to be engaged, which, with the exception of the European Union, means national governments in every other part of the world. That's the highest level of effective governance. Now, most policy analysts, both in Europe, the United States, and increasingly elsewhere in the world, including China, favor carbon pricing. And by carbon pricing, what I'm referring to is either a cap and trade mechanism, an example of which, of course, is the European Union emissions trading system, or a carbon tax, as is also employed in a few countries, particularly in Northern Europe, British Columbia and Canada, and a few other places in the world. So I'm going to refer to both of those jointly as carbon pricing. Now, why is it that policy analysts are so enamored with carbon pricing? The first one is just feasibility. Given that with climate change, we're not talking about 1,000 sources or 10,000 sources in a country. We're talking about millions of sources. So it's every member of the population, every home, every motor vehicle, every lawnmower. All are sources of carbon dioxide emissions. And so there isn't another feasible approach except through the market to send information, incentives, throughout the economy. Sector by sector regulations won't work here, although they do work for other environmental problems. It's also the least costly approach because the abatement costs vary tremendously across sources. So if we have a high-cost controller and a low-cost controller, then we're going to be able to achieve overall the greatest reductions at the lowest cost by placing more of the responsibility on the low-cost controller until they get to the point that everyone is at the exact same incremental cost, or as economists call it, the same marginal cost. That's the definition of cost effectiveness, and that's what the market brings about in general for producing products, and it's also what carbon pricing can bring about in addressing climate change. It's also the least costly approach in the long term because the proper kinds of price signals provide strong incentives for carbon-friendly technological change, which is going to be exceptionally important to bring down the costs over time. Now, most policies in the world have not favored carbon taxes. Whenever carbon pricing has been used, most often, not always, but most often, it's been cap and trade systems. And that's partly because of experience with these. The first was the leaded gasoline phase down in the 1980s in the United States. At the same time as in Europe, you were phasing leaded gasoline out of the market with differential taxation on leaded gasoline compared to unleaded gasoline. In the US, where we have a tremendous aversion to taxes, as you probably know, it was done with essentially a cap and trade system. What became the model for the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme was the sulfur dioxide trading scheme in 1990, which has cut acid rain by half. And whereas the leaded gasoline program saved about $250 million per year for refineries compared to a conventional policy, this acid rain program saved $1 billion per year on a $3 billion cost base, so about a 30% cost savings, while cutting acid rain by half, so a highly successful program. The European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, turning to climate change, is now, of course, the largest cap and trade system in the world. It has been successful. The prices are low for sound structural reasons, so let me get that out of the way quickly. Some people look at the EU ETS and they say with the low allowance prices, the system is a failure. Wrong, the system succeeded. It succeeded because of the fact that for other structural reasons, the recession, extremely large subsidies on renewable power, not only in Germany, but in Spain, but in other parts of the continent. For those other reasons, the prices, as I'm going to show you later, the prices of allowances are low. But just think if you had had a carbon tax or another kind of regulatory policy in place, and then the recession comes along. Recession comes along, manufacturing falls, electricity demand falls, CO2 emissions fall. If you're using another kind of policy, you would continue to punish unnecessarily those sectors because their emissions have fallen. Cap and trade doesn't do that. It automatically loosens up. The allowance price falls, as it should. It is a counter-cyclical policy instrument. In the face of recession, it loosens up. When economic growth accelerates, it tightens up. That's the cost-effective approach. The EU ETS, although it has some flaws we could talk about, and I've written about at great length, the EU ETS is a successful policy. The problem, in my view, are some of the other policies that come out of Brussels. And I'm going to show you a few things about those as we go forward. In the United States, there is a greenhouse gas trading program. It's in the Northeast, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And in California, there is a very ambitious program, at least by US standards, which includes a cap and trade mechanism. And I'm going to talk about that because I think it has some lessons for Europe. So this is under what is called the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. To title a state policy the Global Warming Solutions Act is an incredible amount of hubris, given what I said about this being a global commons problem. But California likes to think of itself not as a state in the United States, but as the 9th largest economy in the world. So it's a broad and ambitious policy. It contains various elements, not unlike the European situation: energy efficiency standards, renewable portfolio standards for electricity production. It has a low carbon fuel standard affecting oil refineries, and it has a cap and trade system, which I'm going to comment on. The cap covers about 85% of the economy, at least starting in this coming year it will, and the cap declines over time, which is how emissions are reduced. It started out giving away the allowances for free, and it's moving increasingly to auctioning over time, mirroring again what's happening in Europe. And it has in place a price collar to control prices, to keep them from dropping too low and to prevent them from rising too high. Therefore, it's actually a hybrid of a cap and trade mechanism and a carbon tax. And then finally, it provides protection for trade-sensitive industries, something I'm going to talk about also because that's an important issue for those of you in this room, I would think. So what are some lessons? Well, the first one is that carbon pricing, as I've argued from an economic perspective, is necessary, but it's not sufficient because there are other market failures. And briefly, just one example of those would be the principal agent problem, as economists call it, that affects buildings. So neither the landlord has an incentive to put in the right amount of insulation in the walls if the rentee, the renter, is paying the energy bills, nor does the renter have an incentive because when he moves on, he can't pull the insulation out of the walls and sell it on a secondary market. It gets capitalized into the property value in terms of future rents. So that's a principal agent problem. And therefore, even getting the prices right don't fully address that kind of issue. There is an argument, even from an economic perspective, for non-economic mechanisms. They might be zoning laws, they might be building codes. Another example is R&D, which is a very important one. So I have here a smartphone, and from the distance that all of you are away from me, you cannot distinguish whether this is an iPhone made by Apple or a BlackBerry Storm 2 made by the still existing BlackBerry Corporation in Canada. Now, the reason I mention this, that you can't tell the difference, is that they're very, very similar. They have a touch screen, they look the same, a lot of similar icons. They're very similar. Apple Corporation spent a huge amount of money doing the basic research and development, the R&D that led to the iPhone, right? They paid all the costs. And yet, BlackBerry seems to have benefited from it. And BlackBerry did not buy patent rights. And BlackBerry, unlike Samsung, was not sued for patent infringement. Because they didn't infringe patents, they learned by just observing. This is something that happens with technological change on a daily basis. And economists have studied this for 75 years. We've looked empirically, econometrically, at how it is that firms benefit from the R&D of other firms. What does that mean? There's a positive externality to your R&D, which means you pay all the costs of your R&D, but you don't get all the benefits. What's the result from an economic perspective? The amount of R&D the private sector carries out will be below what would be the socially efficient amount, because no firm is capturing all the benefits. That's extremely important in the context of climate change, for exceptionally expensive technologies, for a new generation of carbon capture and storage, for a new generation of safe nuclear power, that firms will not have sufficient incentive, and therefore that technology policies will be required. So some policies can be complementary to a carbon pricing policy. But some so-called complementary policies conflict rather than complement. So here's the bad news. I'm going to tell you the story about California, but this applies 100% to the situation in Europe. So in California, in addition to their cap and trade mechanism, they have renewable electricity standards and they have the low carbon fuel standards. In Europe, in addition to the cap and trade system, there are of course the renewable policies, there are the energy efficiency policies. Formerly, these were under separate directorates in the European Commission, now beginning to be united. Well, what are the consequences of that? So let me try to show you. I don't have a blackboard. This is an umbrella. I'm trying to draw a cap of a cap and trade mechanism. The result of the cap and trade mechanism is that different firms in different sectors, if it's economy-wide, are going to be controlling at the same marginal cost. And whatever amount of reduction we're getting, the responsibility will be allocated in a cost-effective manner. But now I look at that and I say, well, you know, I'd really like to get more from a particular sector. I'd like to get more from the refining industry. So I'll put in place a low-carbon fuel standard. Or I'd like to get more from electricity generation. So I'll put in place a renewable policy. Well, there are two possibilities with either of those in the presence of the cap and trade. One is that that additional policy is not binding. The cap and trade policy is binding, in which case that additional policy is irrelevant, doesn't do anything. The other possibility is that that additional policy is binding, which they are in Europe, which they will be in California. And if that additional policy is binding, then what happens? What does that mean? It means we get some additional emissions reductions from that sector that we wouldn't have gotten just with cap and trade. Well, what does that mean? That means that that sector has extra permits that it doesn't need. What are they going to do? Are they just going to put those in the CEO's desk? Are they going to tear them up? They sell them. They're worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of dollars on the market. So those get sold to another sector that wasn't targeted with this additional regulation. The leakage of emissions is 100%. We got some additional emissions reductions in one sector, it completely spills out in another sector. That is what is happening in Europe. That is the effect of the strong renewable subsidies and renewable policies, and not all of, but many of the energy efficiency policies in the presence of the cap and trade mechanism, as long as it's binding. So what are those results? In general, achieving no incremental CO emissions reduction, just relocating the emissions to somewhere else, either geographically or sectorally. Driving up abatement costs, because now marginal costs are no longer equated across sectors. And then also suppressing allowance prices. This is the reason I told you before that the EUA allowances are so low. This is one of the major reasons, is because these other policies are driving down the price because demand is reduced. That's a problem if you want to inspire technological change, which is talked about a great deal in Brussels when there's a lot of hand-wringing over these low allowance prices. Now, I should mention that with carbon taxes, the same problem does not come up, but the major point is that as long as cap and trade is employed, and I applaud cap and trade mechanism. I think it's probably the most effective and practical way for countries to go, so I'm a big supporter of the EU ETS. But as long as those are employed, many of these so-called complementary policies are nothing of the kind. They're really contradictory policies. They're doing nothing additional for climate change, they're driving up costs, and they're suppressing technological change. That's three pretty bad outcomes. So I'm sorry to offer up that bad news. And I've discussed as I go to Brussels regularly, I've worked with the Commission for years, and then maybe when we're not being recorded, I'll tell you about those conversations. Some other lessons. Giving away the allowances for free at the beginning makes sense. It fosters political support. An economy-wide system is feasible, and it's much more effective than a sectoral system. And this price collar has been effective. And unfortunately, Europe is resistant to this because of a political reality, namely, at least this is what I'm always told by people in Brussels, and that is if they put in place a price collar, then the policy would be interpreted rather than a quantity policy as a tax policy, and suddenly it requires unanimity in the Council, which obviously is impossible. And therefore, anything that smacks of price, because it makes people think of a tax, would render the overall policy suddenly illegal, and it can't be done. But the price collar has been very effective in California. Now let me turn, the last major thing I wanted to talk about is this issue of competitiveness, which is naturally a big concern of private industry whenever there is going to be a policy put in place. So if we have a situation in which a particular firm is concerned about its competitiveness, let me take an extreme example, cement production. I don't know if we have anyone represented here from the cement industry. I assume there's cement production in Italy. Cement production is one of the most carbon-intensive sectors because there are not only CO2 emissions from the process, but there are also, of course, CO2 emissions from the energy that goes into what's a very energy-intensive process. So we've got a cement plant in France, and they're very concerned because they're paying the cost of reducing their CO2. They have an additional cost that their competition in Algeria doesn't have. Algeria is not under the Kyoto Protocol. Algeria doesn't have the same kind of national policy. So they're very concerned about their competitiveness. So what does the EU do? What the EU does is says, well, don't worry about it. For those sectors of the economy which are trade sensitive and energy intensive, we'll give you the allowances for free. You don't have to buy them. We'll give them to you for free. Now that makes that company in France very happy because giving you allowances is the exact same thing as giving you a cash because they have a value on the market. And you get that cash and you put it in the bank, you do whatever you want with it. Question, is the competitiveness of producing cement pound by pound, ton by ton, any different for the French company vis-a-vis the Algerian company after receiving the free allowances? No. Absolutely no change in competitiveness because it wasn't on the margin. It's inframarginal. They put the money in the bank, but they still cannot produce cement as cheaply, ton for ton, as the company can in Algeria. Indeed, even after getting that check, put the millions of dollars in the bank, the company in France has the exact same incentives it did before to locate its next investment, its next plant in Algeria. Right? So this approach of giving out allowances doesn't affect competitiveness. It doesn't affect carbon leakage. It doesn't affect jobs leakage. And it's because of this that these attempts at competitiveness protection under the EU ETS have unfortunately been ineffective. There is a way to do it, however, and if you think about it, it would be, okay, we'll give them the allowances for free, but we'll give them the allowances proportional to how big their production was last year. That puts it on the margin. It is now a production subsidy. If I'm giving you $1 of allowances for each ton of cement you produce, I've now lowered your marginal cost of producing cement by $1 per ton. It goes from inframarginal to marginal. And this kind of system, which is used in California, is called an output-based updating allocation. It's a terrible name, but it means that it puts the allocation on the margin, so it does affect competitiveness and it does affect leakage risks. The leakage risks remain for the electricity sector. Ultimately, the only way to eliminate these competitiveness effects is for all countries to be on board, is for all countries to face similar costs of environmental protection and indeed of addressing climate change. And it's because of that we need to look at the international domain. Now, I fear that I'm going on too long, so let me ask our leadership, how much time should I take before I stop? Would you like me to end? I can end now, I can go for 5 minutes, I can go for whatever amount of time you tell me. You can all, we could also ask all of you to vote.
I would like to say that you have nearly finished.
Oh, I'm finished. Okay. That's okay. Absolutely. So let me just draw it to a close. Instead of talking about the international domain, which is going to go beyond, skip that. Skip that. And skip that. And let me go to this, that what I've tried to do is to argue at the beginning, and I hope to demonstrate to some degree with the discussion of climate change, that environmental economics is not oxymoronic, it's not an internal contradiction. Rather, this economic perspective is absolutely essential for a full understanding of environmental problems, and therefore thinking about them economically can be key for designing solutions that are environmentally effective, that are economically sensible, and that therefore are more likely to be politically pragmatic. And I hope the example I gave you of the EU ETS in Europe, which again is a policy that I strongly support, but of the problems, is an example of how economic analysis can be brought to bear to improve a policy, to get the benefits of it, and reduce the costs on private industry at the same time. I went through a lot of material quickly. I didn't talk about the international domain, but if you're interested in learning any more about what I said or what I didn't say, then I would encourage you to go to one of these websites, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, which I direct, the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, which I'm chair of, my own website, my blog, or you could even follow me on Twitter. Or if you'd prefer not to be electronic, if at one of the breaks you hand me your business card, then I'll be happy to put you on our mailing list and keep you up to date on what we're doing at Harvard on these issues. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert. Unfortunately, we have to fight with the time, and so we go on. Just a little joke. It was perfectly clear, your presentation, but I think I'll have a problem with my many members of Assoreca, because we, is a joke, invested a lot of money on the headphone for the simultaneous translation, and I see that nearly nobody took this headphone. So thank you very much, even for this.